Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the RadOnc on the Run podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Mancini, and today we're going to kind of dive into the next era of radiopharmaceutical therapy, which is an exciting, kind of ever-expanding exponential growth within the field of radiation oncology and nuclear medicine. And I'm really honored today to be joined by two of the thought leaders within this space, Dr. Mallika Marar and Dr. Neil Taunk. So thank you so much for you guys being here today.
Nice. Appreciate it, Brandon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon, for having us.
Absolutely. So if you don't mind, kind of before we dive into the nuts and bolts of everything we'll be talking about, if you don't mind just kind of introducing yourself, where you at, what your background entails, and how you kind of originally became interested in radiopharmaceutical therapy, and how that has then evolved into ultimately becoming an important part of your career. Dr. Tonk, if you want to start.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you doing this. This is a really exciting part of the field for radiation oncology and really a new frontier with a tremendous amount of unknowns. Um, I'm an associate professor of radiation oncology and radiology at the University of Pennsylvania. Um, my clinical interests are in prostate, breast, and gynecologic cancers. I lead many of the phase one clinical trials in radiopharmaceutical therapy at Penn Medicine, and my expertise is in late preclinical and first in human radiopharmaceutical therapy work. So I love running trials, and I get to see all types of patients for this type of care: prostate, thyroid, neuroendocrine, and others.
Oh, that's great.
So I'm a clinical faculty at Stanford and the director of theranostics in our radiation oncology group. I split my time between radiation oncology, where I do external beam treatments, and I work alongside our nuclear medicine group in radiology to oversee radiopharmaceutical therapies. And I have a clinical focus in prostate cancer, so mainly administering lutetium PSMA over on the nuclear medicine theranostics side. And I became interested in radiopharm towards the end of my radiation oncology residency. And I was lucky enough to spend kind of an extended period of time with our nuclear medicine group, where at Stanford we oversee radiopharmaceutical therapy. And so through that experience, they decided to hire me on as part of their group in a 50-50 role. And it's been great working alongside them and seeing their perspective on theranostics and really building up a joint practice, which so far I think has had great buy-in from our patients, our referring medical oncologists, and just shows that I think there's plenty of opportunity for collaboration among disciplines in this field.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great. So I think kind of when we look at it, right, there's a lot of buzz, whether it's on LinkedIn, social media, kind of even within the news itself, as far as radiopharmaceutical therapy, what its role is going to be, how it's going to evolve, et cetera. But when you look at radiopharmaceutical therapy today, what makes you believe that we're genuinely entering a new era of cancer care rather than kind of simply adding a few new other systemic therapy options?
Sure, I'll start. Um, so the field has really changed within the last 10 years. I finished residency in 2017 after having done 2 years in a molecular imaging and therapy lab um, in training. And then the first sets of approvals immediately followed. So, early on, there were, radioactive iodine since the 1940s, and then Zevalin and Bexar 20 years ago that have since been withdrawn from the market. But within the last 10 years, there have been three approvals for dotatate therapy, PSMA therapy, and then MIBG therapy in the US. So it's three drugs in the last 10 years. And then the excitement is really real. There's massive investment. There are these very splashy multi-billion dollar acquisitions,
Mm.
and then multiple positive readouts for earlier line indications or additional indications for existing approved radiopharmaceuticals. In the next couple years, there should probably be at least one more for neuroendocrine tumors, and probably one more for prostate cancer. So it's a tremendously invested in field with a ton of clinical trials, several hundred, and a very very eager patient population, physician group that are looking to offer these treatments.
Sure.
Yeah, to build on Neil's points, radiopharmaceuticals have a few aspects of the treatment paradigm that they entail that distinguish radiopharmaceuticals from other systemic therapies and cancer treatments. So we have the theranostics imaging component where we can select for patients in a way that we can't necessarily apply for other systemic therapies like chemotherapies. We're applying localized radiation. We know from our history with external beam radiation that radiation is effective anti-tumor, has anti-tumor effect across the spectrum of malignancies, and so we're able to apply that now for patients with metastatic disease. And we also have the benefit of learning about how these treatments are actually working on a tumor by tumor level through post-treatment SPECT imaging, for example. So there's a lot of depth and potential in refining the treatment paradigms in radiopharmaceuticals, even beyond what we've already seen with the currently approved indications, which even in a less refined approach still have great outcomes for patients and seem to be relatively safe and well tolerated. So there's a lot of depth and potential in the field, which is exciting. And as Neil mentioned, so much investment in looking into new disease sites, new targets, and with a major approval in prostate cancer, when Pluvicto was approved in prostate cancer, I think that was really a watershed event for the field, having an approval in such a large patient population that could benefit from these treatments. And so, necessarily, to follow on with that, clinics will have to build up infrastructure to meet that clinical volume and clinical demand. And so, I think that signals to drug developers that clinicians are learning about this treatment, are invested, are excited, and will be ready potentially for more treatments and new indications in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think building off of that, right? So our background in external beam radiation therapy or brachytherapy, et cetera, obviously we have that ability over many decades to kind of personalize treatment courses, looking at anatomy, dose, fractionation, biology, kind of all the different aspects, normal tissue constraints, et cetera. So how much of that same philosophy do you think is going to translate into the radiopharmaceutical space specifically?
Sure, I can maybe start with that one. So, when I first learned about radiopharmaceuticals, having the radiation oncology background, I was really interested in trying to understand what realistically is the absorbed dose, for example, delivered across a patient's disease burden. And thought it was really interesting that we actually don't consider that on a routine basis. We're applying this more as a systemic therapy, like any other systemic therapy,
Mm.
despite the fact that the main mechanism of action of tumor cell killing is based on absorbed dose to tumor. I think that it's great that we are motivated and interested in learning about radiopharm dosimetry, designing dosimetric methods. Hopefully, one day actually learn more about the radiobiology to the point where we can develop cumulative dose thresholds, for example, for radiopharmaceuticals like we have for external beam radiation. Right now, though, as I said, even in an unrefined approach, maybe we're still getting good outcomes for patients. We know that these are effective drugs that are well tolerated. And thinking about all the practical considerations of trying to estimate absorbed dose, for example, for a patient with metastatic disease, what is the marginal benefit of understanding an absorbed dose across maybe several tumors in a body? I'm not sure. But certainly, as radiopharmaceuticals may get into earlier settings, like curative intent settings, maybe one day, applying dosimetry to understand what the absorbed dose that we should be aiming for, and making sure we're applying that safely, I think is something to work towards.
But Brandon, to your point, you radiation oncologists do enjoy the luxury of years of expertise of dosimetry, which fundamentally means that we can calculate where dose is supposed to go with external beam or brachytherapy. But the challenge is I think the similarities potentially stop there. And then after having been in this for 10 years nearly, the more I scratch, the more I realize, the more we don't know about these principles. So we get to enjoy the benefit of the terminology, a good understanding of early and late effects of radiotherapy, whether that's parenteral administration or external administration. But the deeper we look, the more differences there are, and there's a tremendous number of unknowns. So what's really excellent is that we're really dialed in already with longitudinal patient care, and we offer an existing skill set that can be applied to it. But it does behoove us all as practitioners to continue to get deeper in understanding the principles of nuclear medicine and how best to optimize treatments for these patients.
Sure. No, great points all around. So, and I think if we look like from your perspective in the radiation oncology community specifically, what do you think we get right about radiopharmaceutical therapy, and what do you think we do still misunderstand about where the field is going? So, kind of building off what you're saying, Neil.
Sure. There's a number of things I think we get right. I think great patient care is a thing that we get right. Radiation oncologists, this is a bit self-aggrandizing, is we're a
Mhm.
bit supertentorial and a bit patient obsessed, and that's like all clinical oncologists are, and that's been really excellent to apply to that. Another thing I think we get right is that we offer some dynamic options for patients where it's maybe pretty straightforward to offer a patient treatment with radiopharmaceutical therapy when indicated. But if you zoom out, maybe they'd benefit better from metastasis-directed therapy, um, or even no treatment. Some challenges in terms of where we may need to improve further. We have to rethink our thinking in terms of dose fractions, managing specific problems to really managing the whole patient even more. Because while you're with these patients for 30 weeks, sometimes you become their primary primary oncologist even.
Mhm.
Um, so rethinking that, rethinking how to manage blood work and subclinical renal and marrow toxicity, and then also rethinking some of the safety and practical considerations revolving treatment. There's a tremendous number of efforts that are being built towards this, which I think will be very helpful. And I think more importantly, the community, if by which we mean say community versus say major centers, the community is leading the charge, and this is rapidly growing within the community.
Yeah, to echo some of Neil's points, radiation oncologists really are the de facto experts on integrating local therapy in conjunction with systemic therapy, and that very neatly translates to a radiation oncologist incorporating radiopharmaceuticals into their practices. And then on the flip side, we probably do need to start thinking a little bit more like medical oncologists in understanding how to apply radiopharmaceuticals as a systemic therapy among a host of other systemic therapies that a patient might be eligible for. So thinking through when a patient might be better served by a different systemic therapy that's not a radiopharmaceutical. Ultimately, if that decision making comes to us, we need to be able to think critically and also think collaboratively with medical oncology colleagues about now applying a systemic therapy potentially along with the local therapy that we've always been applying.
Yeah. No, I think that speaks volumes into kind of the complexity of it, right? So a lot of us have done Zofigo in the past or other things where you really just kind of push the medicine every 4 weeks for a certain number of times and didn't have to think too much into it for a lot of situations. And so this is so complex, right? Based on pet uh, pet characteristics, previous treatments received, how it does fit in the puzzle from a somatic and germline mutational testing perspective and all the different aspects. So a lot to continue to learn and evolve, which is makes it super exciting, right? It's like not too often is there like more or less an emerging subspecialty or emerging kind of technology within a field that might create a lot of assistance both across the metastatic and definitive setting, quite like this. So we've kind of touched on a little bit of kind of like the whole personalization aspect of it. And it's used a lot in radiopharmaceutical therapy as far as like we want to be able to personalize it, whether that's selecting the right molecular target. If you had three, four, five different radiopharmaceuticals to choose from, the right radionuclide, whether that's again an alpha emitting, beta emitting, or even something else, individualizing the administered activity, and then things like dosimetry and treatment intervals and cycles and all those sorts of things. But what does that personalization mean to you currently? And then obviously ideal setting in the future, if you can comment on that. So,
Yeah.
Neil.
So, just building upon the previous point, this is a really exciting field, and we're all growing together. The nice thing is we're not learning it alone. So these patients are often co-managed with medical oncologists, and we get the benefit of their expertise to learn with and from them, and share expertise as well. So in terms of personalization, I think the best way to summarize where we are with personalization now is is optimal patient selection. And then once you select the patient they may best benefit from a certain type of treatment, picking the right treatment for them. If we take the example of prostate cancer, you may be deciding, for example, a patient with bone dominant disease in the post chemotherapy setting, whether use whether to use radium versus PSMA therapy. Both can be quite justifiable. Um, so I think the personalization is really in selecting the right patient, selecting the right treatment, and then selecting what we think or best think might be the right sequence for that treatment based in their other care.
Mm.
The remainder, in my opinion, is aspirational and pending additional data. So we'd love to see treatment with, say, maximum tolerated dose right up front from some not yet defined guidelines that are going to come from very smart people, and optimizing, say, post-treatment imaging, or cleaning up maybe smoldering tumors with metastasis-directed therapy. But if we can at least get correct, or mostly correct, the right patient with the right drug, potentially at the right time, that's a significant part of the battle.
Hmm. That's a great point.
Yeah, I would agree that probably the next phase of personalization might relate to the treatment regimen itself. So, on a case by case basis, maybe extending therapy. We now have some retrospective data to suggest that maybe more than 6 cycles can be safely tolerated by patients, or doing a rechallenge of additional lutetium PSMA, for example, after patients already received 6 cycles, maybe a year before, or conversely, maybe pausing therapy before you reach that 6 cycles for a patient who you think has a deep response. As Neil said, maybe integrating local metastasis-directed therapy for any residual, limited residual sites of disease, especially now that we have lutetium PSMA very recently approved in the hormone-sensitive prostate cancer setting. Those patients on the PSMA addition trial were relatively treatment naive. So we expect maybe very deep responses up front with starting anti-hormonal therapy and lutetium PSMA. In that trial, I think 50% of almost 50% of patients had a PSA decrease to less than zero point 0.2 by week 12. So depending on when that clock was started, that's maybe 2 or 3 cycles. So, as we kind of explore refined treatment paradigms, maybe patients won't need up to 6 cycles up front of lutetium PSMA, for example, and we can think a little bit more critically about how to maybe save doses for down the road, as we may also want to spare patients the potential late effects of these treatments as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, because obviously we know that the PSMA positivity of lesions can change pretty rapidly in that hormone sensitive setting. And so, yeah, obviously for a clinical trial design, it's hard to kind of create too much adaptation or ability for clinician to change things. And so obviously the majority of patients on the PSMA addition trial had the full kind of 6 cycles of treatment. But yeah, I mean, those are big time questions that I think make a big difference. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. And also just patient selection in that space, right? Like who, uh, in working with our colleagues in our unique areas and regions and institutions and so forth, like who are the patients that we're going to consider kind of escalating therapy and ultimately is going to be super interesting. So I think it's just great to see that advance, right? I mean, 4 years ago, essentially March of 22 was the first FDA approval for PSMA-directed radioligand therapy with Pluvicto in the United States. And then it was like last March in 25, it had the new indication to go pre-chemo. And then now, about a year later, kind of all the way in the hormone sensitive setting. So it's pretty remarkable in a 4-year span to have 3 separate indications, which is exciting. So, um, so I think just to pick on kind of one of those personalization aspects that I was mentioning, kind of the whole fixed dose, we kind of elected or touched on it to a certain extent. But like when we look 10 years from now, do you think we're going to go back and look at fixed dosing and say, wow, I can't believe we're doing that? Or do you think we're going to say, yeah, I mean, that made sense or still makes sense to that day? What's your kind of gut feeling, or just in your experience, what your thoughts would be?
Yeah, I would love to say that I have experience with significant modified dosing, but on paper, none of us really should outside the trial setting. There's gonna, in my opinion, there'll exist a uh, um, probably a population of patients that most will be treated with, or many will be treated with fixed dose, but then subpopulations that may benefit from something else. Maybe patients that are overwhelmingly likely to respond, and perhaps with these very robust uptakes, or patients that are really sick that maybe they have some organ limiting toxicity. Um, but most, assuming that we think about this like traditional systemic therapies, there'll be guidelines or bands really to start with. Um, True personalization, really every single patient for, say, every single dose is going to require tremendous infrastructure investment and training and technology to get there.
Hmm.
Right. I think trying to understand what the potential benefit of adapting therapy, modifying the administered activity does need some perspective, investigation, and as Neil said, that all of the effort that it would take to really try to personalize treatment by treatment, how much activity you're giving, for example. I'm not sure what the potential benefit might be clinically, even if, let's say, we are changing absorbed dose, does it actually translate to clinical benefit for a patient? Maybe not in the metastatic setting, but would be, maybe more interesting to understand in the intact or curative intent setting. But I think we're many, many years away from that, and uh, you just really can't discount the infrastructure and investment of clinical effort, like Neil said, that would be required for something like that. So, at the end of the day, radiopharmaceuticals fall somewhere in between applying like local treatment to several different tumors and on one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum being just another systemic therapy. They're, somewhere in between. And I don't know that we'll get to full personalization at any point soon, but I still think we're seeing a lot of clinical benefit for patients.
For sure. No, it makes sense. So obviously in our space right now, I mean, the ones that have dominated since 2018, right? It's SSTR, somatostatin targeted treatments, and now PSMA over the last 4 years. Um, as far as targets or other disease areas or things like that, what do you think have the greatest potential to produce kind of those next major breakthroughs? If you had to kind of think within the clinical trial spectrum that's out there, your experience, kind of just thought processes from a radiation biology or even a ability to target certain tumor types. Is there one that kind of sticks out, or a collection of them that seems the most promising?
Well, it's most of my practice focuses on advanced prostate cancer. I'll just say, now that Pluvicto is approved in the hormone sensitive setting, overnight that maybe doubles the eligible patient population for Pluvicto, but that in a few years from now may just kind of pull forward the indication for lutetium PSMA into the hormone sensitive setting. And even today, it would be great to have another treatment option for patients who've progressed after prior lutetium PSMA. So their disease may be still PSMA expressing, so you can think about a different isotope also targeting PSMA, something like actinium, where we have now phase 3 trials evaluating actinium PSMA for the advanced prostate cancer setting. And then there's also, I would say, need today for treatment for patients with prostate cancer who have low PSMA or non-PSMA expressing disease, or disease that develops lack of PSMA expression. So I think those are two areas in prostate cancer right now where we could benefit from additional potential, new indications of radiopharmaceuticals.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree. There's hundreds of trials with a nearly innumerable number of targets. that are available in most disease sites, ranging from prostate cancer to sarcomas. So the classes that, in my opinion, will probably make the most sense are going to be alpha emitting therapies for prostate neuroendocrine tumors. The actinium isotopes are first have the most infrastructure behind them, and they're continuing to mature. Many are in phase 3 trials that are either completed or near completion, or just starting and should be completed in the next year or two. Um, so those agents are probably going to be the first, particularly in patients that have previously received some type of radiopharmaceutical therapy and progressed again. There's other alpha agents, acetine led, but both the infrastructure trials and data for that are not quite there yet. The second group that would probably make sense are repurposing existing um, approved agents for new indications, particularly new disease sites, mostly because these agents are already really well characterized and then can be reapplied to new disease locations. So the most popular really in our field probably right now that's drawing a bunch of excitement is repurposing dotatate therapy for refractory meningioma. So there's a U.S. trial, and then there's also a European trial that will be looking at these in randomized phase twos. And then indications for things like breast, lung cancer, both non-small cell, small cell, um, bladder tumors. There's a number of other indications, but those are all pretty early phase.
Sure. Yeah, and obviously, yeah, the whole alpha therapy buzz, I think, is real. And obviously, being sure that when we're evaluating these new therapies, right, if it's going to pack a bigger punch to the tumor, it might come along with more normal tissue toxicity. And what's the implications of that, depending on when that therapy is delivered, kind of in that patient's treatment journey is huge for sure. And then within the space too, right, either sequential alpha, beta, beta, alpha, or even tandem we're delivering these therapies more or less simultaneously to kind of take advantage of the unique characteristics of both. So yeah, I mean the evolution, it's neat in this field because it's not only target, right? It's radioisotope and all the different characteristics to kind of go together. So I think that kind of leads into another question. Like tumor heterogeneity tends to be a concern for a lot of us, where especially in the prostate cancer space, if you have PSMA positive, PSMA negative, or poorly PSMA avid disease. And I think our experience for a lot of patients, especially in the castration resistant setting, can be that patients may respond initially to PSMA therapy, but then kind of later in those kind of latter half of the treatment uh, sequence that maybe they start having progression of disease there. So whether that's kind of the emergence of resistant clones or just your straight PSMA negative or poorly PSMA avid lesions, obviously that's one thing that needs to be overcome. How do you think we can do better in that sort of scenario currently with the tools we have?
Let's take that example of metastatic prostate cancer. I mean, these patients fundamentally, what we have to appreciate is that treatment for these patients is not curative. Um, uh, it sounds harsh, but some patients may have deep and potentially long responses, but it's really difficult to say that disease is gone, and the goal for that is to change. But on these patients' cancer journeys, they may have oligoprogression where metastasis-directed therapy during treatment may be appropriate either for palliation or to potentially keep on going for treatment. There exists a world where you may choose to offer metastasis-directed therapy for low uptake lesions or no uptake lesions, and then treat with radiopharmaceutical for the rest. The challenge for that is that approach is a thing that we all do, and we haven't fully evaluated. Um, are we meaningfully improving clinical patient outcomes um, with that? So patients will have quite a journey ahead of them, but we can take a quite active approach in terms of what lesions may be there. And to your point, Brandon, about tumor heterogeneity, there does exist a world where you mentioned sequential or tandem, but even cocktail radiotherapies, um, combinations of alpha beta or two different targets at the same time,
Mhm.
are going to be a really attractive target. Some infrastructure needs and some understanding of how do you get a patient multiple different types of PET scans and get someone to cover the cost for that and have the expertise to read it. Um, but tumor heterogeneity is a issue with all forms of cancer therapy, and it will continue to be a challenge in this field.
Yeah, I think working towards maybe multiple multiple uh, tumor target approaches may be a good way to overcome the heterogeneity problem for more advanced cancers. It will be interesting to see how these treatments do in earlier line settings where we expect disease to be more homogeneous. Do we see that then patients respond better or have longer responses to treatment? And do then those patients eventually develop some sort of radio-resistant disease if they've been treated with the radiopharmaceutical earlier on? So, yeah, a lot of interesting questions. It may also open up opportunities for combining treatments with radiopharmaceutical treatments with other non-radiopharm treatments as well, which has been explored in some large prospective randomized trials, but still a lot of opportunity, even just in prostate cancer, to think about how to maybe optimize combinations for systemic therapies. And then, of course, with local therapy, like metastasis-directed therapy, as Neil mentioned.
Mhm. No, for sure. Yeah, I think that outside of like the alpha emitters, it's combination therapy, right? It's trying to figure out what we can do and how we can do better for patients receiving these therapies. So everyone's kind of thinking on the same page throughout the world, which is great. And that's why I think we continue to see these advancements like we are. So I know you mentioned earlier as far as kind of the incorporation of radiopharmaceutical therapy into like maybe really early stage, so non-metastatic cancers as well. Do you think that's going to be something that ultimately is impactful for the vast majority of people, say with prostate cancer and PSMA-directed radioligand therapy, or do you think it's something that can only really make a meaningful impact if there's more advancements in RPT when it's all said and done?
So it's an interesting question. And at least in prostate cancer, we already do try to escalate escalate therapy for intact disease with brachytherapy, for example, or combined external beam plus brachytherapy, allowing us to achieve a higher absorbed dose in the tumor. So potentially, radiopharmaceuticals could also achieve or contribute to a higher local dose within the tumor, and then perhaps also take on a role of treating micrometastatic disease for high risk localized patients. That's definitely still an open question, and we're still probably many years away from even having a trial that evaluates that. But I think the data from the LUNAR trial that evaluated SBRT plus or minus lutetium PSMA for oligometastatic hormone-sensitive prostate cancer did show some interesting preliminary data to suggest that lutetium PSMA as a beta emitter may be able to treat micrometastatic disease, so allow the external beam, the SBRT, to treat the macroscopic disease, and then for whatever may be below the level of PSMA PET detection, that disease can at least be partially controlled by a radiopharmaceutical. So certainly in prostate cancer, there's a lot of interest in finding ways to delay time until starting hormone therapy or extend time off of hormonal therapy, just given the host of side effects we see with that. But a lot more rigorous evaluation will be required to actually define the place of a radiopharmaceutical in these earlier line settings like oligometastatic disease and intact disease for sure.
For patients with, say, non-metastatic disease, um, there's still probably a pretty long runway, except for the most high-risk patients. Many of these patients are curable, and with, say, radiotherapy or surgery alone. And to move a systemic therapy to that line would really require data to support, of course, its efficacy. Now, those studies are already underway for a number of different types of prostate cancer, and a handful of really excellent clinical trials. For example, ProCure1 in node positive non-metastatic prostate cancer. I'm calling node positive non-metastatic in this example, um, or the Starlet trial, which is run by Angela Gia at Pace Western. So those are looking at integrating radiopharmaceutical therapy in patients with really non-metastatic disease. The Roadster clinical trial is combining brachytherapy along with radiopharmaceutical therapy for some kind of dose escalation with that. So the goal is, are we trying to say we have to figure out a way if radiopharmaceutical therapy is going to incrementally improve outcomes for patients with, say, non-metastatic disease, or for patients that can't or won't do hormone therapy, but radiopharmaceutical therapy does have to show meaningful clinical outcomes that are better than, of course, the standard of care. And then understanding that the side effect profile is quite different. So a patient that has a 10-year runway for life minimum, committing him to, say, radiopharmaceutical therapy for maybe the renal toxicity, marrow toxicity, myelodysplasia, or salivary toxicity, really has to show a substantial benefit. But delaying resistance to hormonal therapy, for example, in the PSMA-DC study and other studies, is also very attractive and quite meaningful to patients.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the most common things that they bring up is like, is there any way that they can either discontinue or delay starting? So we know how impactful that can be. Um, so kind of switching gears to just the field of theranostics kind of in general, right? As we kind of briefly discussed, kind of the merging of multiple subspecialties, right? And not really an ownership thing, but just the collaborative nature of you need urologists, nuclear medicine physicians, radiation oncologists, medical oncologists, pharmacists, radiation safety, and kind of all the different fields, subfields, and so forth in medicine. How do you personally feel or see just the field of theranostics changing over the next 5 to 10 years? Are we going to see like dedicated fellowships? Are we going to see training programs? Are we going to see certain specialties kind of grab hold of it? Is it going to be the emergence of a theranostician, like a unique subspecialty that can have multiple ways to kind of be originated from? Kind of what is your gut feeling as you've had experience in the field over the last few years?
Go for it, Neil. Do you want to start?
Please, you're welcome to.
Well, I was gonna say, actually, Brandon, that made me think of you kind of paving the way in this space because you've kind of focused your clinical practice on theranostics, specifically having trained as a radiation oncologist. So that's great for folks like me to see when I was in training. It's when I first met you, and to see that a radiation oncologist had really taken ownership over a theranostics practice was definitely very inspiring. And I think, as you're saying, the future we're only going to need more and more authorized users, clinicians able to care for patients undergoing radiopharmaceutical therapy. I do see some dedicated fellowships emerging, just for more in-depth clinical experience in this space. But ideally, radiation oncology trainees should be able to get comprehensive theranostics experience as part of their standard residency training. I think that's something that Astro is certainly committed to supporting. And of course, drug developers too want there to be enough trained authorized users, clinicians who could administer these treatments. So it's a great question. And I think the most successful theranostics programs at large institutions where you have nuclear medicine folks and radiation oncologists overseeing therapies, for example, is kind of a strong, centralized, collaborative vision, really at maybe the cancer center level that includes leadership from radiation oncology, nuclear medicine, medical oncology, urology, other subspecialties who care for these patients long term, and trying to avoid a scarcity mindset in terms of who's specifically overseeing treatment, and think more about actually growing a practice successfully and making sure that patients who are eligible for treatment are getting treatment in time, because I think today we still operate on a relatively limited infrastructure where, at least in my practice, many patients have to drive hours to get to us for treatment. And as you know this, new indication for Pluvicto has come about, and, there's so many radiopharmaceuticals in the pipeline. I think hopefully most centers are thinking about ways to expand their own network, expand access to radiopharmaceuticals, so that patients are not maybe waiting as long as they are today to get treatment when they're indicated for treatment.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's great.
So, radiation oncologists should have demonstrated competency by the end of residency training to be able to manage patients like this and deliver this type of therapy. The challenge is that the minimum requirements for competence don't necessarily align with competence to maybe coordinate and run a program,
Mhm.
and then minimum competence doesn't necessarily translate to excellence beyond that. So the training standards for people who really want to do this probably need to be elevated. Malika had indicated already that between Astro and manufacturers, there's a massive push to make sure that the workforce is trained, not just from the physician AU perspective, but also for medical physics as well as nuclear medicine technologists, to make sure that everyone can build out these programs to get patients treated. Um, there there's probably going to be theranostics fellowships. Most radiation oncology fellowships are not accredited, and this may become one of them that's offered in a handful of specialty centers. And in general, I would largely encourage trainees who are interested in doing this to ideally pick a center that does a lot of it, and then if not, seek out a center that does a lot of this, and be able to really grow that skill set from a minimum competence to excellence for when you go to your final position.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think kind of playing off that theme as far as even getting into like today's residents in radiation oncology, like for those listening or watching, if people want to incorporate radiopharmaceutical therapy in a meaningful way, what else should they be doing during their training? Um, Obviously, independent of where they're at and kind of their exposure, but is it just going to a training center? Is it trying to take elective time somewhere else that has that exposure? Like, again, depending on the variety of different backgrounds people have, what are some other things that they could enhance their training and their trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, so you training at a large volume center is always it's a really an easy way to gain
Yep.
confidence, and
Oh, for
that's
sure.
just a very very good way to do it. But Astra does have dedicated training centers for essentially these kind of mini fellowships to
Mhm.
get you there. Uh, uh, Commercial partners also with training opportunities. The Astra Multidisciplinary Radiopharmaceutical Therapy Symposium, as well as SNMMIs. The Beyond the Beam resource, also from Astro. So there's a variety of opportunities, but learning the trainees should be aware to learn um, the didactic information, so clinical data, trial data, but really also the on treatment management, which you may need to work with a medical oncologist to learn that new style or edited style of management, and then finally all the practical aspects of therapy, including radiation safety concerns, managing spills and extravasations. You're expected to know those things. This is also maybe a uniquely American perspective in which radiation oncologists in the U.S. are qualified or could be potentially qualified to give this type of therapy, and in other countries, it's not the case. So, nuclear medicine really has demonstrated through dedicated long residency training programs in other countries that they have deep knowledge and they're quite comfortable managing this along with a clinical oncologist.
Yeah, I think as Neil mentioned, like a first step of understanding the didactic piece of radiopharmaceuticals, there's many resources out there for trainees to access, even if there's not maybe an established radiopharmaceutical curriculum within your own residency program. Then beyond that, ideally you're at a place that's overseeing plenty of radiopharmaceutical therapy, either uh, with radiation oncologists directly involved, which is great because, that those are your colleagues that you can work with. But even like in my case, where at my institution, nuclear medicine had historically overseen radiopharmaceutical therapies, taking initiative to, find time to rotate with nuclear medicine colleagues, for the most part, they appreciate that. They appreciate the different perspective we have as radiation oncologists. And I found that I could be really helpful and contribute a lot as a radiation oncology trainee to a theranostics clinic that is nuclear medicine run. So that's definitely, something that I think trainees have an opportunity to kind of build a bridge for. And you even politics aside or local dynamics aside, everyone kind of agrees that we need to train more competent clinicians in this space. So, really ideally, trainees should be able to bridge that gap, even if, like I said, radiation oncologists may not be directly involved with radiopharmaceutical therapy at a given institution.
Sure. No, that's great. So I think kind of staying in the theme of obviously that's the trainees kind of early career. What about your established radiation oncologist 10, 15, 20 years into practice, community, academic, kind of everywhere in between? Like, why should they kind of take a vested interest in radiopharmaceutical therapy just from an understanding perspective? Um, what would you kind of tell them listening to something like this?
Yeah, there's a number of reasons why everyone should be aware of this. First is that a patient that's been exposed to this type of therapy is going to increase, and it behooves us as radiation oncologists. One of our mentors, or one of a lot of people's mentors, Eli Gladstein, had always commented on you need to know every treatment, and you should know it so you can have good conversations about it, but also counsel patients. Um, so you're going to see this in the community, really at every level. So first, knowing about it is important. The second is practice building and revenue streams, as practices want to establish potentially new opportunities to do that, whether they want new patients or a halo effect to build up their own external beam volumes. There's different reasons to want to know this. There are potential challenges, though. I'm solidly mid-career, and I'm already forgetting things that I've quite learned in training that I'm supposed to know forever, much less trying to learn new things right now. It's always a challenge with
Yeah,
time. So I'd advise people to seek ideally more formal training opportunities initially, but maintain um, uh, continually informal relationships with established practitioners to make sure that we all learn from each other and stay abreast of best practices.
for sure.
Agreed that, these are our patients too who are getting radiopharmaceutical therapy are also the same patients who will be getting external beams. So at a minimum, understanding where radiopharmaceuticals are incorporated into a treatment paradigm is really critical for any radiation oncologist. And we are the experts in understanding how radiation is applied as a cancer treatment. And so we will face clinical scenarios where a patient has received some amount of radiopharmaceutical therapy, and now we have to think about applying a local external beam potentially on top of that, and think about cumulative dose or even just local radiation side effect considerations, which there aren't great answers to at this point, but really we're the ones that I would say are poised to think critically about those questions. And as someone who might be, mid-career or late career with an established radiation oncology practice, I think thinking about incorporating radiopharmaceuticals could definitely start with a conversation with medical oncologists, urologists. That practice building piece, as Neil said, is really important to understand who the patients are that are likely to benefit from this treatment in a specific scope of practice. So I think starting from that collaborative mindset will be helpful in building up a practice because it's definitely a very multidisciplinary field. And even though some of these treatments are well advertised, you still need referring physicians to help manage patients long term. And I think that will be important for radiation oncologists who are looking to add on radiopharmaceuticals to an existing practice. And then As Neil mentioned, the Astro Radiopharm Symposium that you led, Brandon, was a fantastic opportunity to meet other radiation oncologists also at different phases of building up a radiopharm practice. And I think there's a lot of shared learnings that can be applied across radiation oncology practices that way.
Absolutely. No, that's great. So kind of as we finish up, I want to do something fun, like a rapid fire finish. So you can only answer it either in a word or just like the shortest phrase possible, just to kind of have some fun with it. Um, so I will say a phrase or a question and you just answer. And we'll just keep it simple. Maybe Neil go first since you're unmuted. I see. And then Mallika, if you want to come off mute, we'll just do it rapid fire. So we'll start easy. So fixed dosing or personalized dosimetry?
Emerging area of study.
Yeah, fixed dosing for now, maybe more personalization in the future.
All right. Alpha, beta, or both?
Increasingly alpha.
There's definitely room for alpha, I think, in the near term. Whether it entirely replaces beta, I don't know.
Sure. Most promising target beyond PSMA and SSTR?
At this time, FAP, but a lot of promising targets.
Agree. A lot of promising targets. I'd love to see how radiopharm does for a target that's already approved for a different treatment modality. So there's a HER2 ADC, for example. What would a HER2 radiopharmaceutical look like? DLL3 T cell engager, something like that. Well, I would be interested to see what a radiopharm against already established target would do.
Yeah, great. RPT earlier in disease, is it inevitable or still uncertain?
Let's go with inevitable. The data has continued to march forward, but it's going to be harder to say. It's going to be inevitable for everybody.
Agree. Disease site by disease site may be inevitable in some, and we know that radiation is an effective anti-cancer treatment across the spectrum of malignancies. So that's good news for radiopharm.
Right. Biggest barrier to widespread RPT adoption? Biggest barrier.
Workforce training.
I'll go with the infrastructure to both get the treatment to the clinic and then within the clinic itself.
AI in RPT planning, do you think would create incremental improvement or a major disruptor?
Incremental improvements with potential for, how do you call it, workflow optimization.
Mm.
Potentially disruptor just in the dosimetry space, but will dosimetry ultimately be a disruptor? I'm not sure. That may only add an incremental benefit to the clinical application of radiopharm.
Sure. Will every major radiation oncology department have a theranostics program by 2035? So they get 8.5, 9 more years.
I don't think so. I think it's going to be institutional dependent and dependent on the priorities of that department and cancer center.
I think our field is small enough that there's a lot of fear of missing out. So I'm gonna say yes. I think pretty much all big RadOnc centers would have some theranostics involvement by the next decade.
Sure. All right, last rapid fire, and then we'll close it out with one more. But one prediction about RPT you're willing to put on record today. Super broad, but one prediction about RPT that you're willing to put on record today. We won't hold you to it.
There'll be a novel target approved within the next 3 years.
Got it.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me.
It's a big one.
Yeah, think through. We'll just go with Neil's for now.
Sounds good. Yeah, yeah. So I think like if we fast forward a full 10 years from now, we sit down and have this conversation again. Kind of what is one thing you hope in radiopharmaceutical therapy that we're going to be talking about? So same conversation, same meeting 10 years from now. What do you hope that we're going to be talking about as something that's prominent within RPT.
I hope that we'll be talking about there are going to be a percentage of patients that we will cure with RPT alone or in combination in some early line of therapy. Confidently cure. That's what I hope.
That's awesome.
I would hope that we're starting to establish some understanding of the radiobiology of radiopharm and specifically normal tissue sensitivities to these treatments in the short term and long term.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise. It's been an awesome discussion, and the end was fun too. So I think everyone's going to value everything you guys have to say with your experience and your perspective. I mean, this is the way we spread education and information and all the good stuff. Continue to have the conversation, continue to be involved, and really appreciate your time. So,
Thank you,
Appreciate
Brandon, for
it, and
inviting.
yeah,
thanks for inviting us.
absolutely. So that concludes another episode of the RadOnc on the Run podcast. We'll see you next time.